Welcome to Chapter by Chapter. My name is Brian Thomas Kropp, and I will be your host for this episode. I believe that stories have a tremendous power for good, and so I write them, and I enjoy sharing them with you. If you are new to the podcast, how this goes is in just a moment you will hear a chapter from a book that I have written, and then on the other side of that chapter, we will get into some of the how the sausage was made, so to speak, how the chapter got written, or what goes into writing a book, publishing a book, or just any Easter eggs that I may have dropped in there. So where we are right now, we're in the middle of a book called Shell Game, which is part 2 in a series that I'm in the middle of called The Pearl Saga. And if you would like to run back to the first book, you can. It is not important to get the full enjoyment out of Shell Game. But that first book was called Showdown in the Yukon. And where we are in Shell Game is we have our main character named Evan Gold, and he has recently discovered that his partner, who had been on a stakeout to help a client find her missing father, somehow he got shot and killed, and Evan doesn't know kind of what's going on and how can he help find the murderer of his partner. In the middle of all this, he is a bit of a hobbyist in junk trading, and so he has found at a local bazaar a sack of probably worthless jewelry, but he hasn't had a chance to go through it yet because things keep cropping up. His partner has been killed, his marriage is failing, and he's bumped into his wife, and they've kind of had a tense conversation, and he's trying to just kind of get his hands around what's going on. So he has just found out about his partner when this chapter starts, and so I will leave you to this chapter right after we hear from this week's sponsors. This episode is also sponsored by Showdown in the Yukon, the first book in the Pearl Saga. It is a story of Monterey Jack Danvers, who is a reformed pickpocket who is hired by his old partner in crime to help rescue a stolen gold claim up in the Yukon Territory for a widow. He also finds the widow's daughter quite attractive, and that helps him go on this adventure that takes him on stormy seas, through caves, through forest fires, and being hunted down in forests, and all kinds of great adventure. And the big question is, will they be able to rescue this gold mine, this gold claim back from the evil man who took it from this poor widow woman? And then what kind of man does Monterey Jack Danvers turn into by the end of the story? It is also the prelude to Shell Game, part 2 of the Pearl Saga, and you can find Showdown in the Yukon at Amazon.com. You can also find the links to that over at BrianThomasKropp.com.
Chapter 7. Evan stood at the front door of his office and stared at his reflection in the glass. The diffused moonlight spilled on just enough of his body that he could see his shape without his face. Just the shell of a man, Evan thought. He took one more deep breath before inserting his key in the front door lock. The key turned, but the deadbolt was already detracted into the door. Immediately, Evan forgot about his dead partner and his broken marriage and wondered who had been snooping around his office, why, and if they were still inside. He entertained the possibility that he'd forgotten to lock it after Catherine's departure, but he dismissed that quickly. He more often locked it without thinking than the other way around. Evan pulled the door open slowly, eased himself in, and guided the door closed without making a sound. He stood still, his ears straining to hear anything, breathing, the sound of clothes, or anything else. When he felt confident he was alone, he walked towards Sophie's desk without turning on any lights. The foggy moonlight filtered through the front windows, illuminating the furniture's white papers and chrome details. A quick scan of Sophie's desk in the outer office showed nothing was obviously out of place. More confident of his surroundings, he continued back to his inner office only to find the door standing brazenly open. Evan retraced his memory and was able to remember locking this office door before leaving that evening. For a moment, Evan toyed with the idea of fishing one of the revolvers he kept locked in the gun safe, but the safe was in his office just on the other side of the door. If there was an intruder inside, there was no way to get a gun, so he would have to use his fists and hope that was enough. Evan slid into his office with deft and expert movement and visually confirmed that the office was indeed vacant. He breathed a sigh of relief, made a beeline back to the front door, and turned the deadbolt to secure himself inside before returning to his office to assess any damage. Evan pulled the chain on his desk lamp and saw the neat piles of paper spread far and wide across his desk and onto the floor. The stacks of paperwork were there, so clients would think he had more going on than he did, so he didn't worry if anything had been taken from them. Evan's eyes scanned the room. This had to be the work of a lone burglar instead of a gang of thugs determined to intimidate. He also ruled out a rage-fueled maniac bent on avenging some past grievance with him. No, this was surgical, a treasure hunt. But what was the treasure they sought? Evan stood in the middle of his office, surveyed the mess, and let his mind run through all the possibilities. The door to the coat closet was ajar, and the desk drawers were open and had been rummaged through. Carefully, methodically, one by one, Evan pulled the drawers open, assessed the contents, and eventually determined everything seemed in order. Then he pulled open the drawer which held his desk safe. The finish around the dial had some new scratches, likely the use of a screwdriver or chisel. Evan walked over and inspected the gun safe and saw that it had received similar damage. Evan looked around again. It wasn't like he didn't have enemies, but to have his partner murdered and his office broken into on the same night seemed somehow personal. Then his mind flashed to the strange transaction at the flea market that afternoon. Evan wondered if somehow that sweaty mess of a man had succeeded in tracking him back to his office, waiting for his moment to strike. Evan returned to the desk safe, spun the combination, pulled the handle, and was relieved to see the flour sack resting quietly inside. All this over a $10 sack of junk, Evan mused to himself. The value of his purchase increased by the moment, it seemed. After all, a man so intent on getting his hands on this menagerie must mean there was something quite interesting inside that might sell well over the purchase price. Just for safety's sake, and to keep any more curious crooks guessing, Evan decided to move the sack to his most hidden nook. Getting on his hands and knees, he dug his fingernails in the edges of a particular set of short floorboards under his desk chair, revealing a tidy compartment installed by him for just such an occasion. Evan lifted the sack from the desk safe and nestled it in the snug opening. Just like putting a baby down to sleep. Nice and cozy. He patted it with paternal affection before replacing the boards. Then he got the notion to check in on his find. After all, what if the crook was more competent than he seemed? What if he replaced the contents with something of no value at all? Evan pulled the boards up again and pulled the sack from its crib. He unfolded and rolled the top of the bag down and peered in. Everything seemed to be in order, if a jumbled mass of golden chains was orderly. Evan's eye landed on the oversized pearl pendant, which peeked out from the other chains of gold. It caught his eye because it seemed to be glowing. At first, Evan thought this might be a trick of the moonlight, but quickly dismissed this when he realized he was between the pearl and any light coming in through his office window. He reached in the bag and brought out the curious pendant. The orb felt mildly warm in his palm. Evan stood and was about to place the pearl under his desk light for inspection when he heard someone pull on the front door. Evan froze and shifted his eyes to look in the direction of the front door. From where he was, he could not see the door directly, but in the reflection of a framed picture by Sophie's desk, Evan could just make out a man's figure pressing himself against the glass door. Evan tried to slow his breathing and focused on his next possible moves. Because of the careful arrangement of his office, Evan knew he was unseeable if he remained still. So, he kept on the desk light so as not to advertise his presence, ever so carefully. Evan gathered up the pendant, chain and all, in his right fist, placed both hands on his desk, and shifted his weight to the balls of his feet. His eyes darted over to the gun safe again. It was still impossible to get to it unseen, nor was there time to secure a weapon if this person made his way inside. So, he squeezed his hands into fists in case he needed to defend himself. He locked his eyes on his target and exhaled slowly. Whatever was about to happen, he would be ready to spring in any direction. The figure fished in his pocket for something and quickly began working on the lock. Evan decided that if this shadowy person tried to be sneaky a second time, instead of pulling a smash and grab, it was safe to spook the intruder. He reached up and pulled the chain on his desk lamp, dropping the whole office into utter darkness. The figure froze. The two men stood motionless for what seemed like an endless minute, both deciding and assessing their next move. Evan inhaled another slow breath. He never blinked. Then, as if spooked by something else approaching from the outside, the figure darted off into the night. Evan spun to the window behind his desk to see what he could see. Whichever way the man fled, Evan was not able to spy him from that vantage point. 5 minutes later, Evan Gold felt himself exhale before stepping away from the window. He stuck around the place for another 10 minutes to make sure the stranger was gone. Only then had the adrenaline retreated enough from his bloodstream for him to remember he still held his hands in fists. He loosened them, and the pearl pendant dropped to the floor. It no longer seemed to be glowing, just another pearl. He picked it up and slipped it into his pants pocket. It was, he remembered, the only item from his flour sack that he was even remotely interested in. He tidied up the top of the flour sack and pushed it back into the floor nook. After replacing the floorboards quickly, Evan headed out through the back alley. He figured if he could make it safely home and get at least a couple hours of shut-eye, he might then be able to put his mind to figuring out his partner's murder, the sweaty man, and the possible connection between the two. This was what he loved and hated most about this part of every case. All loose ends and no connections. The possibilities were endless.
So there are a couple of things going on in this chapter that are sort of related to one another that I want to talk about what that relationship is. And it involves a bad writing habit that I have had for years. And that is that I write, I'm going to call it fast. It might be shallow. I just leave a lot of detail unexplained a lot of the time. Some of this goes back to, again, my background is more in writing scripts for stage performances than writing novels. So you get away with a lot of not describing things or just being able to infer things. So you've got actors who can kind of carry some of the load as far as what the meaning of things are. And that would get me into trouble when I was, writing papers in college. There would be more detail that I could have included, but I would say have an assignment for a 10-page paper and be struggling to get to the end of 5 pages. I had other friends who were having a hard time paring down from 20, but I was having a hard time coming up with the 10 because I think I just either assume a lot or overlook things or whatever it is. And I was reading a book called Bird by Bird by Anne Lamott, who, it's an interesting book. It's sort of on writing, but it's sort of not on writing too. But one of the things that she talks about is this idea, which you've heard a lot probably if you've been in the writing space at all, is the idea of showing, not telling. So instead of saying Jimmy was happy as he walked down the street, you could say a smile broadened across Jimmy's face as he walked lightly down the street. There's just a way to show the emotion without having to say what the emotion is, or show what the action is without saying what the action is. You can kind of describe what's going on. And I have a hard time with that. not philosophically, it's just a skill that I have a hard time with. But what she described, which was kind of helpful, and I think probably in revisions of this story has helped with this, is look through, imagine the scene that is in your mind, and then place a 1 inch by 1 inch frame around one part of that scene, and then describe everything inside of that frame. And some of that will be emotion, and some of that will be color, and some of that will be texture, and some of that will be action. But if you can kind of focus in on some of those littler details, that can help. So I could imagine a normal me first draft of this particular scene would have been like I was re-listening to this and hearing all of the care that Evan was putting into the flour sack, and the care that as he was noticing the different details of where this intruder may have been trying to find, whether it's the flour sack or some other thing, that is not normal for me. That took some time to kind of slow down and describe little tiny things that are going on in the story. And one of those, it's sort of the same thing, but it's longer. If it was a normal me, I would have shown the pearl pendant in all of its glory, probably when Evan first found it in the flea market a couple of chapters ago, instead of doling it out over time. And some of that is, if you have read Showdown in the Yukon and you kind of are picking up on any number of cues that this is a big deal, you're excited, like, oh, what's going to happen with the pearl? Because there was so much going on with the pearl in the last book. And when is he ever going to actually get to it? So at that level, it's a little bit of dragging out the inevitable reveal of the pearl. But then if this is your first time encountering the story and you know nothing about the pearl, it also is highlighting that, and there must be something going on with the pearl. So, but I don't know what that is. So intentionally, I'm trying to slow down and be a little more intentional with how those details get brought out. The other thing that I personally enjoyed about writing this story that doesn't have anything to do with me slowing down and getting a little more granular in the details. Obviously, I'll say this one last thing. It's easy to get, I say easy, not for me. I would imagine that it'd be super easy to get lost. I'm going to get so granular in the details that nothing actually moves forward. So you do have to keep in mind there is a plot that needs to keep moving forward, so you can't get stuck there. And I have a word count goal for each of my chapters. So that has also helped me slow down, because I would blow through a chapter in 100 words when I have a 1,500 word barrier to get through. And so I can go back through and go, okay, well, I need to add detail. I can't just blow through stuff and assume. One of the things that I was also playing with in this story, I tend to see what is in my mind, and that's all that's going on, and everything that's happening off screen, so to speak. Everybody's just standing still and nobody's doing anything. And in this one, it was very important to have the off-screen characters doing things independent of what we were seeing with Evan. So this little moment where the guy at the door gets spooked by something and runs away, he did get spooked by something. He did run away, and that plays into other things that we discover over the course of time. That some of the books that I was reading to get ready to write this book, I enjoyed the fact that the hero of the story, the main character of the story, did not know everything, and that there were independent actors exerting their will outside of his viewpoint. And that was affecting how he was going to have to solve the case. So little thing in there. If you keep listening, then you can try to figure out what happened at the door to spook that guy. So Anyway, I guess that's sort of a future Easter egg for a future chapter. But I hope you do enjoy Shell Game and are enjoying this show. If you do, I would encourage you to swing over to wherever you listen to this and leave a review for that. If you haven't gone over to brianthomascrop.com, you can leave me your email, and I'd be happy to send you some other stories and let you know future releases and those kinds of things. You could also swing over to Amazon. You could leave reviews there if you've picked up the book. Or if you haven't and would like to, I would appreciate it if you go grab yourself a copy of any of the books, whether that's Showdown in the Yukon or Shell Game, Casey Jackson in the South Acre series, or any of my other books. You can give them as gifts, give them to yourself, which would also be a gift if I could be so arrogant as to say that. But either way, I hope that you have a good week, and I hope to see you back here next time.